Economy line is to the left, sir. This lane is for our priority guests. The gate agent said it without looking up, without checking a single thing, without asking a single question. Just one smooth, practiced sentence delivered with the particular brand of casual authority that comes from saying the same dismissive thing to the same kind of person so many times that it stops feeling like cruelty and starts feeling like procedure. Nate Cole heard the sentence the way he had learned to hear sentences like it, fully completely without flinching, storing every detail the way a man stores evidence he might need later. He had been hearing variations of that sentence since he was 12 years old, standing at the entrance to spaces that the world had quietly decided were not meant for someone who looked like him. And in 32 years, he had developed a kind of internal architecture around the experience. Not a wall exactly, more like the deep structural reinforcement of a building designed to withstand repeated impact. He was 44 years old. He was wearing a faded, dark green Howard University hoodie that he had owned for 11 years, not because he couldn't afford a different one, but because he had been wearing it the morning he signed his first $1 million deal, and he had never seen a reason to replace something that still worked perfectly well. His boots were scuffed leather broken in over a decade of airport floors and conference room carpets and the cracked sidewalks of cities across 3 continents. His bag was a simple canvas duffel worn at the strap, carrying nothing more dramatic than a change of clothes and a thick leather-bound dossier that contained, among other things, the most consequential documents of his professional life. Portland International Airport moved around him with its usual Tuesday evening energy, the particular controlled chaos of a hub airport in the early hours of a transatlantic departure. Push flight boards, cycling through gates, rolling luggage, clicking across tile, the ambient noise of 1,000 private urgencies colliding in a shared space. The rain outside was doing something serious against the terminal glass, blurring the tarmac lights into soft orange and white halos. The kind of rain that made the interior of the terminal feel sealed off from the ordinary world, a pressurized environment where the normal rules of outside life were suspended and replaced by the compressed social hierarchy of departure gates. Nate had been standing near Gate C-14 for about 20 minutes, nursing a coffee that had gone lukewarm while he stood at the window, watching the ground crew work in the rain, thinking about nothing in particular, which was something he rarely got to do and therefore took seriously when the opportunity presented itself. The deal was done. 4 months of negotiations, of carefully constructed silence, of intermediaries and holding companies and documents that referenced other documents that referenced other documents. All of it had culminated 3.5 hours ago in a mahogany-lined conference room 12 blocks from this airport. And now Nate Cole was quietly and without fanfare the majority shareholder and sole owner of Apex Continental Airways, the very airline whose Zone 1 boarding lane he was currently being told he did not belong in. He had not told anyone at the airport. He had not called ahead. He had not arranged any kind of welcome or acknowledgement, because that was not how he operated and had never been how he operated, and because if he was honest with himself in the way he tried, always to be honest with himself, he had wanted to experience the airline exactly as its ordinary passengers experienced it, without the buffer of recognition, without the altered behavior that came with the knowledge that the owner was watching. He was getting that experience now. A woman in her late 60s, standing 2 people behind him in the boarding lane, glanced at him the way people sometimes did not. With hostility, not exactly, but with the quick, unconscious recalibration of someone whose mental image of who belonged in this line did not immediately include a black man in a Howard hoodie with a canvas duffel bag. The glance lasted 2 seconds. She looked away. Nate noticed. He always noticed. He had simply learned over the course of a lifetime that noticing did not require responding. The boarding call had gone out. Zone 1. First Class and Diamond Elite members. Nate stepped forward, raised his phone to show the digital boarding pass on the screen, and a gate agent stepped directly in front of the scanner and looked at him with an expression that had already made its decision. The conference room on the 14th floor of Hargrove, Lenox and Wills was the kind of room that had been designed specifically to make financial transactions feel like historical events. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A long table that reflected the overhead lighting in a way that made everything placed on it seem simultaneously important and permanent. Nate had been in rooms like this dozens of times and had never once been comfortable in them, which he considered a professional advantage rather than a personal failing, because comfort in rooms like this had a way of making people stop paying attention to what was actually happening in them. What was actually happening at 5:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November was this: 6 attorneys, 2 investment bankers, and the outgoing board of Apex Continental Airways were watching Nate Cole sign the final countersigned acquisition document that transferred majority ownership of the airline to his private equity firm, Cole Meridian Capital, which managed $85 billion in assets across 4 continents and had been quietly building this position in Apex Continental for the better part of 18 months. The pen made a soft sound against the paper. The cap clicked shut. Across the table, Diane Okafor, Nate's lead attorney, a woman with the focused calm of someone who had been the smartest person in every room she'd ever entered and had long since stopped needing anyone else to notice, leaned slightly toward him and said in a voice low enough that only he could hear it, "You're the majority shareholder as of right now." Nate nodded once. Handshakes followed the way. Handshakes always followed these things, perfunctory, professional, carrying the specific hollow warmth of people who have just concluded a transaction and are now performing the ritual of having enjoyed the process. The outgoing board chairman, a silver-haired man named Gerald Fitch, who had the polished bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one, paused before releasing Nate's hand and said something gracious and well-constructed that managed to communicate absolutely nothing. Nate thanked him. Without warmth, but without hostility, the specific calibrated neutrality of a man who has learned to reserve his warmth for people who have earned it. In the elevator alone descending toward the lobby, Nate finally exhaled a long, controlled breath that he had been holding in one form or another for approximately 4 months. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the specific weighted clarity of someone who has just accepted a responsibility that he knows will be harder than the achievement itself. He had not bought Apex Continental for its routes or its fleet or its market position. He had bought it because of a file that sat in the restructuring section of his dossier, 3 years of customer complaint data annotated personally, cross-referenced by incident type and crew identification, building a picture so consistent and so damning that it stopped looking like individual failures and started looking like a culture that had been allowed to calcify around a set of beliefs about which passengers deserved dignity and which did not. He had read every complaint personally, every single one. 347 documents ranging from 3-line emails to 12-page letters written by people who had clearly spent days composing them, trying to articulate something that resisted easy articulation, the experience of being made to feel at altitude in a sealed metal tube with nowhere to go, that your presence was an imposition. His phone rang. Raymond Osei, COO, calling from New York. "It's done. It's done. When do you land in London?" "If the flight leaves on time." Raymond laughed a short, warm sound. "Try not to fire anyone before takeoff." Nate didn't laugh. He changed into the Howard hoodie in the law firm's bathroom, tucked the acquisition dossier into his canvas duffel, and took a cab to the airport alone. Derek Albright had been the lead gate agent for Apex Continental's international departures at Portland International for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had developed an approach to the Zone 1 boarding lane that could most charitably be described as zealous, and most accurately be described as something that revealed a great deal about the man who practiced it. He was 39 years old, with hair gelled so precisely flat that it appeared to be a structural element of his appearance rather than a grooming choice, and he moved through his workspace with the particular rigid energy of someone who had assigned enormous personal significance to a position that the rest of the world would have assessed somewhat differently. He guarded the first-class boarding lane the way certain people guard things that don't belong to them with more intensity than the actual owner would ever feel, because the power of exclusion is always most intoxicating to the person who didn't build what they're protecting. The boarding announcement for Zone 1 came through the terminal speakers with its standard measured warmth, and Nate stepped forward from the line with his coffee still in hand. Phone raised, the digital boarding pass lit and ready on the screen. Derek moved before Nate reached the scanner, not a step backward, not a half step to the side, but a deliberate forward placement of his body directly in front of the optical reader. A physical interruption that required a decision, and that decision had been made before Nate had taken his second step. Derek's eyes traveled the full length of Nate's appearance. Howard hoodie, canvas duffel, scuffed boots in the practiced 2-second sweep of someone who had been conducting this particular assessment for years, without ever once being required to examine whether the assessment itself was accurate. His gaze returned to Nate's face and settled there with an expression that managed to be simultaneously apologetic in its surface presentation and entirely merciless in its actual content. "This lane is reserved for first class and our Diamond Elite members," Derek said, speaking with the slow, over-enunciated clarity of someone who believes the person in front of them may have a comprehension problem. "Economy boarding commences in about 20 minutes. That line forms to the left." I know Nate set his voice level in the specific way that level voices become when they are performing a great deal of interior work that they have chosen not to make visible. That's why I'm in it. He raised the phone, the boarding pass bright and readable on the screen. Derek did not look at the screen. He looked at Nate's hoodie, then at the canvas bag, then back at Nate's face, and the expression that crossed his features in that moment was the expression of a conclusion being confirmed rather than a question being considered. "Sir," Derek said, and the way he said "sir" managed to communicate something quite different from respect. "I don't know if you purchased a fraudulent upgrade through a third-party site, or if there's been some confusion with your reservation, but we are completely sold out in first class on this flight, so I'm going to need you to step out of this lane before I have to involve port security." He paused, then added with a helpful tone that was somehow more insulting than the words themselves. "The economy line has shorter wait times this evening." Behind Nate, 2 people in matching cashmere coats made a sound of impatient agreement. Nate did not flinch. He did not argue. He reached forward unhurried and placed the barcode of his boarding pass directly beneath the red laser of the optical scanner himself. The scanner read the code and let out a loud, clean affirmative beep. The monitor turned to face Derek, lit up bright green. "Cole Nathaniel seat 2, a first class cleared." Derek stared at the screen, then at Nate, then at the screen again. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which contained anything resembling an apology. "Looks like the system accepted it," Nate said quietly, collecting his phone with the same unhurried calm with which he'd presented it. "Have a good evening, Derek." He walked down the jet bridge. The heavy silence of the gate area followed him. Derek watched him go. Then he picked up the gate phone, dialed the aircraft's forward galley, and began to speak in a low, urgent voice that he would later deeply wish had never been recorded. Cassandra Vale had been with Apex Continental Airways for 22 years, and she wore that tenure the way certain people wear expensive jewelry, not as adornment but as declaration. A constant visible reminder of her standing in a world she had organized very precisely around the question of who mattered and who did not. She was in her early 50s, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe, immaculate chignon that looked as though it had been architecturally designed rather than styled, and her Apex Continental uniform fit her with the precision of something custom-made, which it was a small accommodation the airline had extended to senior pursers on the transatlantic routes, a distinction that Cassandra had accepted as her due because she believed without particular examination of the belief that distinction was her natural condition. On her lapel sat the Pinnacle Service Award pin, a small, beautifully crafted platinum wing given to fewer than 30 Apex Continental employees in the company's entire history, recognizing what the internal materials called exemplary service standards and guest experience leadership. Cassandra touched it sometimes without realizing she was doing it the way people touch things they believe protect them. She received Derek's call in the forward galley while making final pre-boarding preparations. The phone pressed to her ear, her expression not changing as he spoke. She heard the description, the hoodie, the canvas bag, the scuffed boots, the specific instruction that she keep a very close eye on the passenger in 2A, the clear implication underneath all the words that she should treat him as something other than what his boarding pass said he was. She said, "Understood. I'll handle it." And she would because handling things was what she did, and because the picture Derek had painted matched a picture she had already learned to recognize and respond to in a particular way over 22 years of working this route. For the next 15 minutes, Cassandra was magnificent in the way that people with genuine professional skill can be magnificent when they choose to apply that skill selectively. She remembered names, preferences, travel histories. She greeted Preston Walsh, the finance executive, in seat 3, a red-faced, loud Bluetooth earpiece still broadcasting some ongoing deal into the cabin with the warm familiarity of an old friend offered him his preferred champagne by name, adjusted the ambient temperature at his suite without being asked, laughed at something he said that wasn't particularly funny. The couple in 1A received warm towels. The woman in 2B received a specific sparkling water she had mentioned on a previous flight 16 months ago. Cassandra moved through the premium cabin with the fluid, attentive grace of someone who had genuinely mastered the craft of hospitality and chose in this moment, as in so many others, to practice it for some passengers and withhold it from others based on a calculus she had never once written down because it had never needed to be written down. And then Nate stepped through the aircraft door. He offered a polite nod, said good evening in the easy, unhurried way of someone who has flown enough to understand the ritual without being invested in it. Cassandra's expression changed in the space between one breath and the next. The warmth she had just displayed for Preston Walsh switched off as cleanly as a light replaced by a smooth professional neutrality that was in its own way a very specific form of message. She extended her arm, blocking the aisle with the practiced authority of someone who had done this before and expected it to work, told him economy seating was through the curtain. Nate stopped. He was still. He said he was in seat 2A and he pointed past her shoulder to the empty suite 3 steps away. Cassandra told him she needed to see his boarding pass not with curiosity, not with procedural courtesy, but with the flat, suspicious energy of an interrogation. She took the phone from his hand, which was not protocol, had never been protocol, and which Nate noted with the same quiet precision with which he noted everything, examined it with theatrical thoroughness, scrolled, checked, and finally returned it to his chest without warmth, without apology, without anything, and told him to take his seat and keep his bag out of the aisle. "We have important people boarding," she said. Nate slid into suite 2A, stowed his duffel, opened his dossier to the restructuring section, and looked at the Apex Continental logo embossed on the cover sheet for a long moment before beginning to read. 20 minutes passed. The boarding process completed itself around Nate with the organic efficiency of a system that had been running long enough to become invisible overhead bins closing with soft thuds. Seatbelts clicking the low, settling sounds of a wide-body aircraft accepting its load and making the small mechanical adjustments of a structure preparing to do what it was built to do. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The pre-departure mood settled over the premium section like a specific kind of quiet that costs a great deal of money to be near. Cassandra moved through this quiet like a woman in her natural habitat, and in watching her Nate understood something he had already suspected from the complaint files, but now saw with his own eyes. She was genuinely good at her job when she chose to perform it. And the choice of when to perform it and for whom was the entire architecture of the problem he had bought an airline to fix. She refilled Preston Walsh's champagne before the glass was half empty, anticipating the need with the attentiveness of someone who had trained herself to read the body language of the passengers she had decided mattered. She adjusted the lighting in the suite of the couple in 1A without being asked. She brought a warm blanket to the woman across the aisle who had mentioned being cold only once, quietly 20 minutes earlier. She was in every interaction she chose to have a model of what premium cabin service could be, and in every interaction she chose not to have a model of something else entirely. Each time she passed the entrance to Nate's suite, her eyes moved across it with the smooth, unbroken momentum of someone walking past empty space. Not aggressive, not hostile in any visible way, simply absent. As though the suite's occupant had not registered, as though the signal he was emitting was on a frequency her instrument had been calibrated to miss. Nate raised his hand at a natural moment unhurriedly, the way you raise your hand when you want something and have no reason to believe it won't be provided. He asked for a glass of water. Cassandra stopped mid-stride with the expression of someone who has been interrupted by a sound they weren't expecting from a direction they weren't monitoring. She turned toward him slowly, not the quick, accommodating pivot she had been performing for every other passenger in the cabin, but a deliberate, effortful rotation that communicated in the specific language of body and tone that Nate had spent a lifetime learning to read, that she was doing him a favor by turning at all. She told him boarding was a busy time. She told him water would be served after takeoff. She turned and walked away before he had formed a response. He looked across the aisle. Preston Walsh was lifting his third crystal champagne flute to his lips. 2 minutes later, Maya appeared from the galley, 23 years old. Cornrow braids neatly pinned at the back of her head, the junior flight attendant's particular form of visible nervousness expressed in the way she carried the drink tray with both hands, when one would have been sufficient. As though the extra hand was an apology, she was presenting in advance. She had a plastic cup of lukewarm tap water. She set it in front of him and said in a voice low enough that only he could hear, "I'm sorry, sir." Cassandra said we were out of the pre-departure bottled water. Nate looked at the plastic cup. He looked at Preston Walsh's crystal flute with its 2-inch pour of vintage champagne. He looked at the cup again. Then he looked at Maya. He said, "Thank you, Maya." He said her name the way people say a name when they want the person to understand that they have actually been seen, not processed. Maya blinked the specific blink of someone who was expecting something different and received something that briefly undid the preparation she had made. She retreated to the galley, and Nate noticed her glance back once at Cassandra before the curtain closed. He opened his dossier to the customer complaint section and read his own annotations in the margins, his handwriting small and dense, with the particular compression of someone who writes quickly when the ideas are coming faster than he can slow them down, and everything he had written in those margins was everything he was currently sitting inside at 30,000 feet in a plastic cup. In seat 4B, a young man with a laptop had quietly stopped typing. Preston Walsh finished his Bluetooth call with the kind of theatrical conclusion that people perform when they want the people around them to understand that the call was important, a phrase about closing numbers, a laugh that was approximately 40% louder than the joke warranted, and a decisive silence as he pulled the earpiece out and set it on the tray table like a prop he had finished using. He was the kind of man who took up space with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never once been asked to take up less, and in the specific ecosystem of a first-class cabin, he was entirely in his element known by name to the crew comfortable with the particular entitlement of the frequent flyer who has learned to confuse familiarity with importance and deeply, instinctively attuned to the presence of anyone who he felt had disrupted the balance of a space he believed himself to own. He looked at Nate's suite for a moment with the assessing squint of a man doing an inventory, then snapped his fingers twice in the direction of the galley. Not urgently, the way you snap your fingers when you actually need something, but with the lazy authority of someone who has learned that snapping fingers at service staff produces results, and has never had a reason to develop an alternative. Cassandra materialized beside him with the attentiveness she reserved for passengers she had classified as worthy of it. "Mr. Walsh, what can I get for you?" Preston didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at Nate's suite. Then he pointed, not gestured, but pointed with the extended index finger of a man indicating a problem for someone else to solve in Nate's direction. "What is the deal with this guy?" he said, his voice pitched at the volume of someone who either didn't notice or didn't care that the object of his commentary could hear him. "His bag is sticking out into the aisle. He looks like he wandered in from the wrong terminal. I paid for this section, and I shouldn't have to sit next to—" He paused, making a vague gesture that substituted for the specific word he had decided not to say while preserving its meaning entirely, whatever this situation is. "Did you guys lower your standards?" Nate's duffel was stowed completely under the footrest, not 1 inch of it visible from the aisle, which meant that Preston Walsh had just made something up and presented it as a complaint, and every adult in the first-class cabin who was paying any attention at all had heard him do it. Cassandra did not correct the lie. What she did instead was more instructive. She looked at Nate with an expression that managed to combine contempt and apology in a single glance, then turned back to Preston with the warm conspiratorial smile of a person signaling that they are on the right side of a shared understanding. "I completely understand your frustration, Mr. Walsh," she said, and her voice carried through the cabin with the easy projection of someone who wanted to be heard by more than her immediate audience. "We've had some system difficulties at the gate today. I'll handle this right now. In seat 3, B. Lena Schultz, a pediatric surgeon from Seattle traveling to a conference in London who had spent the past 20 minutes pretending to read a novel while actually cataloging everything happening in the cabin with the observational precision her profession had spent years developing. Put the book down in her lap, took out her phone, and placed it on the armrest face up. Cassandra walked toward Nate's suite with the specific body language of someone who has made a decision and is approaching the moment of executing it, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, the institutional authority of the uniform deployed like a garment designed for exactly this use. She stood over him. Closer than service protocol permitted, closer than any neutral professional interaction required. She announced that there had been a ticketing error. She announced that seat 2A had been double-booked for a Diamond Elite member. She announced that his luggage was improperly stowed and creating a safety hazard. Nate looked down at his duffel bag, which was so far beneath the footrest that it was touching the fuselage wall. He looked back up at Cassandra. He said calmly that his boarding pass had been scanned, verified, and accepted, and that he was the sole confirmed ticket holder for this seat, and that the seat was his. Cassandra leaned in. Her voice dropped to a register she used when she wanted to convey a threat without its being heard by anyone who might later repeat it. She told him he had 2 choices: move to seat 42J in economy voluntarily, or she would ask the captain to halt the pushback and have him physically removed by port security. Nate looked at her for a long moment with the stillness of a man who has learned that stillness in the right moment is louder than almost anything else. And then he told her very quietly that if she continued, the consequences for her career would be severe. Cassandra let out a laugh, short, sharp, mocking, and turned toward the forward galley and called for the captain. Preston Walsh began to clap slowly with the satisfaction of a man who has watched something he commissioned being performed. Lena Schultz turned her phone over in her hands and made a quiet decision. Captain Howard Briggs had been flying transatlantic routes for 26 years, and in that time he had developed a finely calibrated sense for the difference between a situation that required intervention and a situation that had been misrepresented to him in a way that required a different kind of attention entirely. He stepped through the cockpit door with the measured, unhurried authority of a man who had learned that the worst thing a captain can do in an uncertain situation is move too quickly, and he took the 4 seconds it took to cross the small distance of the first-class cabin, using them to read the room in the way that his years and experience had taught him to read rooms, not the faces closest to him first, but the whole picture. the spatial arrangement of tension and silence and body language that told him before a single person spoke that something was not adding up. He had expected a difficult passenger. He had been told there was a difficult passenger. What he saw instead was a man sitting with complete composure in a leather suite, with a corporate dossier open on his lap, a plastic cup of water on his tray table, and the specific kind of patient stillness that is in Briggs's experience the opposite of difficulty. It is the quality of someone who has decided to let a situation arrive at its own conclusion, rather than accelerating it. Cassandra spoke first quickly before the captain had fully oriented himself. Her version of the preceding 20 minutes delivered in the practiced shorthand of a senior crew member, briefing a superior, framing herself as a professional, responding to provocation, framing Nate as a belligerent passenger, refusing lawful crew instructions and making threats. Briggs listened. He kept his face neutral. He turned to Nate. Nate's version was shorter, quieter. It covered the same events from the same evening and arrived at an entirely different picture. And the difference between the two accounts was not only in the content, but in the texture. Cassandra's version had the slightly elevated energy of a story being constructed under pressure, while Nate's had the flat, specific gravity of a man describing something that simply happened and doesn't require embellishment because the facts are sufficient on their own. Preston Walsh from across the aisle offered his assessment without being invited to told the captain the man was a menace, told him to get the flight in the air, told him he had a board meeting in London that couldn't wait for whatever this was. Briggs raised a single hand toward Preston, and Preston stopped talking. The captain looked between Cassandra and Nate again, and what he felt in that moment was the specific discomfort of a professional whose training was telling him one thing while his instincts were telling him another. Protocol said, "Support your crew." His instincts said, "Look closer." Protocol won, as protocol usually wins in the short term. He told Nate that if the purser had reported a ticketing error, he was required to ask for compliance pending resolution on the ground in London, and that he didn't want to delay the flight any further, and that compensation for any inconvenience could be arranged through customer relations once they landed. There was a silence in the cabin. Nate closed his dossier carefully. He looked at the captain with an expression that carried no anger, no accusation, and no performance, just the clean, unadorned honesty of someone about to say something that cannot be unsaid, knowing that the moment will clarify everything. He told Captain Briggs that he understood completely that Briggs was responding to the information he had been given, and that before Briggs made the decision to call security and have him removed, he would like the captain to permit him to make one phone call. Cassandra made a sound, something between a sigh and a laugh. The particular noise of someone who has decided the situation is already over. "Who are you calling your lawyer?" Nate looked at her. His expression did not change in any way that could be named. "I'm going to call your new boss." He dialed. He put the phone on speaker. He placed it on the leather armrest of Suite 2A with the care of someone setting down something that is about to become very loud. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, British accent, crisp, the particular vocal clarity of someone who is used to being heard in large rooms, and said, "Nate, is everything all right? Have you taken off yet?" It was Raymond Osei, COO of Apex Continental Airways, calling from New York, and his voice filled the first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 as completely and undeniably as if he were standing in it. "No, Raymond." Nate said, his voice perfectly steady. "We haven't taken off. I'm in seat 2, A on flight 112, and your senior purser, Cassandra Vale, is currently attempting to have me arrested and removed from the aircraft because she doesn't like my hoodie." A silence came through the phone that was different from ordinary silence. It had weight and temperature, and the specific quality of something about to change irreversibly. Then Raymond said, "She is doing what the physics of the cabin changed. It was not a dramatic change. No one moved. No one shouted. The mood lighting held its steady amber warmth, and the low mechanical hum of the aircraft at rest continued its patient frequency. But something shifted in the atmosphere of the first-class section, the way pressure shifts before a storm, where the air becomes a different thing, even before anything visible happens, and every person in the cabin felt it simultaneously. Captain Briggs's hand, which had been making a slow, uncertain transit toward his radio, stopped moving and stayed where it was as though it had been placed there by someone else. Preston Walsh lowered his crystal champagne flute in the slow, careful way of someone placing a fragile object on an unstable surface, very precisely making no sudden movements, as though the glass itself had become the least important thing in his immediate environment. His face, which had been wearing the satisfied expression of someone watching a problem be efficiently solved, went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then recognition, then the specific pallor of a man who has just understood something. He very much wishes he had understood 60 seconds earlier. In the world Preston inhabited, Nate Cole's name was not obscure. Cole Meridian. Capital managed $85 billion in assets, had reshaped 3 major industry sectors in the past decade, and was the kind of firm that people like Preston Walsh kept track of, the way sailors kept track of weather systems with the respectful attention of someone aware that the scale differential between their position and the others made direct comparison inadvisable. Cassandra's posture did not collapse all at once. It went in stages, the way a structure loses integrity when the thing it was built around is removed. The shoulders first, then the precise set of the chin, then the rigid, professional authority of the arms. The whole architecture of her presentation coming apart in the sequence. It had been constructed like watching something built be carefully reversed. The Pinnacle Award pin on her lapel caught the amber light and held it. She stared at the phone on the armrest as though it were a thing that had no right to exist. Raymond Osei's voice filled the cabin, addressing Captain Briggs directly, and what he said was precise and complete, and left no available interpretation. Captain Briggs, the man you are looking at is Nate Cole. As of 3 hours and 40 minutes ago, he is the majority shareholder and sole owner of Apex Continental Airways. You are currently standing on his airplane, and your senior purser is attempting to have him removed from his own first-class suite by port security. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that cabin had ever heard. Nate ended the call. The screen locked with a soft, small click that sounded in the context of the silence around it like a door closing. He looked at Captain Briggs and spoke without heat, without triumph, and without any of the things that a person who had spent the last 45 minutes being humiliated might have been expected to feel in this moment, which was itself the most damning thing about what he said. If you had known I owned this plane, this conversation would not have happened. That is the problem I bought this airline to solve. Not you, Captain. You acted on what you were given. But the thing that generates what you were given. That. Lena Schultz, 3. B let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding for a considerable time and picked up her phone from the armrest. Preston Walsh made a rapid recovery attempt, stood up from his suite, smoothed his tie, pasted on the wide, urgent smile of a man who has spent a career pivoting quickly from wrong positions to ones he found more survivable, and said, Nate, look, I had absolutely no idea. I've been at the Goldman Summit Brooks Capital. I think we were on the same panel in Miami last spring. This flight attendant misrepresented the whole situation to me. I was only trying to support the... Nate raised one finger. A single finger pointed directly at Preston's chest without looking at him. One word. Sit. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It contained the specific compressed authority of someone who has spent decades learning exactly how much force a situation requires, and applying precisely that amount and not one unit more. Preston Walsh sat. He looked straight ahead. He did not say another word. In seat 4, B. Arjun Mehta, who had been entirely still for the past 8 minutes. His laptop open, his hands resting beside the keyboard. Without touching it, began to reach very slowly for his phone. Nate asked Captain Briggs to hold the jet bridge and send for Derek Albright from the gate desk, and the way he said it, not as a request, not as an order exactly, but with the quiet, conclusive weight of someone describing the next step in a process that has already been decided, made it clear that this was not the beginning of a confrontation, but the final movement of one that had already been going on for some time. The cabin settled into a charged stillness while they waited, the kind of stillness that has substance to it, not the comfortable ambient quiet of a cabin preparing for departure, but something denser and more alert. The silence of people who have just watched the architecture of a situation rearrange itself completely, and are now watching with the full and undivided attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be worth remembering to see what comes next. Maya stood near the galley curtain with her hands at her sides and her face composed in the particular expression of someone who has been expecting something terrible for a long time, and has just discovered that the thing that arrived instead was something different, not safety exactly, not yet, but the first recognizable outline of the possibility of it. Nate looked at her, not in passing, not as part of a general survey of the cabin. He looked at her specifically with the directed attention of someone who has made a decision about what they want to say and to whom they want to say it. He told her that she was the only person aboard this aircraft who had treated a passenger with basic human decency in the past hour and a half. And he said her name when he said it, the way a person says a name, when the name is the point, when the act of using it is itself the acknowledgement that a person has been seen as a person, rather than processed as a function. Maya's composure held for approximately 3 seconds after he stopped speaking, and then something happened in her eyes that was not crying but was in the same neighborhood as crying, the specific quiet overwhelm of someone who has been bracing against something for so long that the sudden absence of pressure is itself destabilizing. She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything, and she didn't need to. Cassandra watched this exchange from the position she had retreated to near the forward bulkhead, and the expression that moved across her face in that moment was the first one in the entire evening that did not belong to her professional repertoire. Something unfamiliar, uncomfortable, that she could not have named if she had been asked to. Heavy footsteps echoed down the jet bridge, and Derek Albright came through the aircraft door wearing the expression of a man who is arriving to collect a victory he has already been informed is waiting for him. Chest forward, grin in place, rubbing his hands together with the specific energy of someone who has been looking forward to this. He announced that the police were standing by at the top of the bridge ready to remove the passenger. He said he'd known from the moment the ticket scanned green that something was off. He walked down the short aisle with the confidence of someone who has mistaken the absence of resistance for the presence of authority, stopped beside Cassandra and looked down at Nate in Suite 2A with his smirk at full width. "All right, buddy," he said. "Fun's over. Time to grab your bag and take a walk." Cassandra closed her eyes. Captain Briggs told Derek to stop talking. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said it with the clipped, absolute finality of someone who has been in command of large machines and the people inside them for 26 years, and has learned that the clearest communication is usually the shortest. And then he explained, enunciating every syllable with the careful precision of someone ensuring that information lands with the weight it deserves, that the man sitting in Suite 2A was the new owner and CEO of Apex Continental Airways. Derek's smirk did not fade immediately. It froze, first held in place on his face by the brief neurological delay between receiving information and believing it. And then it moved through a sequence of expressions that might have been almost comic in a different context. The smirk into uncertainty, the uncertainty into disbelief, the disbelief into the first cold touch of something that was not yet fear, but was fear's immediate neighbor. He looked at the Howard hoodie. He looked at the scuffed boots. He looked at Nate's calm, patient eyes, the eyes of a man who had been waiting with considerable professional discipline for exactly this moment. He said, That's not possible. He scanned an economy ticket or he hacked and his voice was doing something it had not done in the entire preceding hour, which was losing confidence in its own content even as it produced it. Nate interrupted him. He did it gently, which was more devastating than doing it otherwise, and he listed what Derek had done in the same precise, organized way that someone reads from a document they have been preparing for a long time. The physical blocking of a verified passenger in the Zone 1 lane, the public accusation of fraud, the advance phone call to the aircraft crew, the specific words that had been used in that call, words that the gate system's audio log had recorded in full and which Nate's legal team had already confirmed were on file. He asked Derek for his employee ID number. He opened the back page of his dossier and uncapped his pen. The pen was a Mont Blanc, not a demonstration of wealth, just a pen that Nate had been using since his first year out of business school, the first expensive thing he had ever bought himself. The same pen he'd used to sign the acquisition documents 3.5 hours ago, and the sound of it clicking open in the silence of the first-class cabin was the sound of a door closing. Derek's posture, which had been the primary architectural feature of his personality for the entirety of his career at Apex Continental, collapsed with a speed and completeness that suggested it had never had deep foundations. He mentioned his family. He mentioned that he had been following security protocols. He mentioned that international routes had high rates of fraudulent ticketing. Nate acknowledged each thing without softening anything. The 2 Port of Seattle police officers, whom Derek had himself summoned and positioned at the top of the jet bridge, were now standing in the galley doorway, having been guided down by a junior crew member, and they were looking between the captain and the man in the hoodie with the carefully neutral expressions of people trying to determine which of their initial assumptions about this situation required revision. Nate addressed them directly. He identified himself. He requested that Cassandra Vale and Derek Albright be escorted off the aircraft pending a full investigation. He was precise about the legal framework suspended without pay pending HR review for Title VII violations and gross misconduct, with the testimony of the COO, the captain, and every witness in the cabin available for record. He looked at Maya. Please collect their company IDs and their service credentials. Maya stepped forward. Her hands were not entirely steady, but they were steady enough. She asked in the professional voice she had been trained to use and had been using all evening in spaces where it was not reciprocated for their badges. Cassandra reached up to the lapel of her uniform with both hands. Both hands because one was not sufficient and unpinned the Pinnacle Award, the small platinum wing that had been on her jacket for 6 unbroken years, and placed it in Maya's open palm. The weight of it in that moment, in that context, was enormous. The jet bridge door closed behind Cassandra and Derek with a sound that was entirely ordinary. The mechanical latching of a pressure seal, a sound that happened dozens of times on every departure, on every flight, at every airport in the world, but in the context of the first-class cabin of Apex Continental Flight 112, it sounded final in a way that ordinary mechanical sounds do not usually manage. The cabin exhaled. Not audibly, not dramatically, but the collective physiological release of a group of people who have been holding something carefully for an extended period and have just been given permission to set it down, which is its own unmistakable sound if you know how to listen for it. Nate addressed the cabin briefly and without theater. He apologized for the delay. He announced that every passenger aboard Flight 112 from the first-class suites to the last row of economy would receive a full refund of their ticket price and a complimentary international round-trip voucher effective immediately as a direct consequence of what had occurred on this aircraft this evening. A cautious, surprised, slightly disbelieving applause moved through the cabin, quiet enough to be genuine. He added one exception. He looked at Preston Walsh, who was sitting with the rigid, forward-focused posture of a man who has decided that the best available strategy is invisibility, and he spoke to him quietly and without particular emotion. If Preston Walsh ever addressed Maya or any member of the Apex Continental crew in the manner he had used this evening, he would be permanently banned from any airline operating under the James Global portfolio. Walsh nodded several times very quickly and looked straight ahead, and Nate turned away from him before he had finished nodding. He told Captain Briggs the flight was cleared for departure whenever the replacement purser arrived. Captain Briggs, a man whose professional composure had held through the entirety of the preceding hour with impressive consistency, gave a nod that carried in it something additional, something that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite apology, but occupied the quiet space between the two where honesty lives when it can't be said directly. He returned to the cockpit without another word. Nate called Maya over. He told her that beginning with this flight she was serving as acting senior purser, not because she was next in line by seniority, but because she already knew how to do the job. He told her she had been doing it all evening without a title and without anyone noticing, and that the difference between what she had done and what the title represented was only the recognition, and the recognition was now being given. Maya looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone receiving information that does not fit the category of things they had prepared themselves to receive. Then she went back to the galley, and through the gap in the curtain, Nate could see the other junior crew members watching her, the particular stillness of people watching something change. He leaned back in Suite 2A and pulled the Howard hoodie slightly tighter against the cool, recycled air of the cabin. He opened his dossier to a page near the back where 4 months ago he had written a single line that he returned to regularly the way you return to a sentence that keeps being true. Culture is not what leadership says it is. It is what the lowest paid employee experiences at 6 a.m. He underlined it again. Outside the runway, lights blurred through the rain into soft orange rings, and the ground crew moved through the mist in their reflective vests, doing the ordinary quiet work of making departure possible. In Seat 4, B. Arjun Mehta began to type. The Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate at Portland International at 9:47 p.m., 43 minutes behind schedule into the rain. Arjun Mehta was 31 years old, a technology and business journalist for a digital publication called The Current, that had 4.1 million subscribers, and a reputation for the kind of reporting that prioritized accuracy over pace, which was rarer in his profession than it should have been. He had been traveling to London for a conference, not a story. He hadn't even brought his professional recorder, only his phone and the laptop that was always with him, and the story had arrived at him the way stories sometimes do, by sitting down in Seat 4B on Flight 112. And opening his laptop to work on something else entirely. He had been watching since the moment Nate boarded. He was by professional formation and personal inclination a careful observer, and what he had observed in the cabin of Flight 112 over the preceding 90 minutes was one of the clearest and most complete illustrations of the pattern he had been writing about in various contexts for 3 years. The particular cruelty of institutional contempt, the way it operated through small denials and slow accumulated dismissals, rather than any single dramatic act, and the specific human cost of a culture that had learned to dress its worst behaviors in the language of procedure. He typed for 47 minutes using the aircraft Wi-Fi with the focused calm of someone who knows exactly what they want to say because they watched it happen. He was careful with names. He was precise with details. He included 3 photographs taken on his phone during the escalation. Cassandra's arm blocking the aisle. Derek's grin in the seconds before understanding reached him, and Nate sitting in Suite 2A with the acquisition dossier open and legible on his lap, while 2 police officers escorted Cassandra and Derek off the aircraft, and he wrote captions for each one that required no additional explanation. He drafted the article 3 times. The third draft was 1,100 words. He read it once more, changed 2 phrases, added a sentence in the final paragraph that he had been thinking about since the moment Cassandra placed her pinnacle pin in Maya's hand, and published it at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time, 31,000 feet above the middle of the country. By midnight, 200,000 people had read it. By 2 in the morning, the article had been shared by 3 major news organizations, a civil rights advocacy network with 11 million followers and 1 sitting U.S. senator who responded with a single sentence that became briefly the most liked comment on the platform: "This is what accountability looks like." By the time Flight 112 descended through the gray Heathrow morning, the article had 1.4 million views, and climbing, and Cassandra Vale's name was in a headline on 7 different news platforms, and Derek Albright's recorded words from the gate audio log the 4-word phrase he had used to describe his instruction to Cassandra, the phrase that had been captured on the system recording and was now reproduced in full. In paragraph 3 of Arjun's article were being quoted in comment sections across 3 continents by people who had never been on an airplane. In a fluorescent-lit HR compliance office at Portland International Airport, a compliance officer placed a printed copy of the article in front of Cassandra and Derek, who had been sitting in that office for 2 hours composing their accounts of the evening. Cassandra read her name. She read the 4 words. She read the sentence that followed them, which was Arjun's sentence, the one he had added in the final draft. The most extraordinary thing about what happened on Flight 112 was not the moment of reckoning. It was the 80 minutes before it during which a man sat quietly in a seat he had legally purchased and simply absorbed with dignity and without theater what was being done to him. She said nothing for a long time. Outside the compliance office window, the first departure of the morning taxied slowly toward the runway, its navigation lights blinking patient and steady in the early Portland dark. The arrivals hall at Heathrow Terminal 5 at 7 in the morning has a particular quality of gray fluorescent light that makes every person moving through it look as though they are operating under mild protest, which is an accurate representation of how most of them feel. And Nate Cole moved through it the same way he moved through most things, unhurried, self-contained, carrying his canvas duffel on one shoulder and his dossier under one arm and the full weight of the preceding night somewhere behind his eyes where it hadn't yet finished settling. Raymond Osei was waiting near the arrivals barrier in a dark overcoat, his tablet already out, and he had the expression of a man who has been awake since receiving a phone call at midnight and has been running calculations about the implications of that call ever since. He and Nate walked together toward the car without preamble. They had known each other for 11 years and had long since graduated from the social padding that newly formed relationships require. Raymond walked him through the numbers with the compressed efficiency of someone who knows. His audience has already accounted for most of them. Apex Continental's stock had dropped 14% in pre-market trading when the New York Exchange opened, which was significant but not catastrophic. 3 major corporate travel accounts, multinational firms that collectively represented approximately $40 million in annual Apex revenue, had contacted the airline's account management team overnight to express concern and request a call with senior leadership. The board had convened an emergency session for 9 a.m. London time. 2 aviation industry publications had run front-page pieces before dawn. Nate listened to all of it. He let Raymond finish. Then he asked, "How is Maya doing?" Raymond paused for a fraction of a second, the micro-pause of someone recalibrating their expectation of what the next sentence would be, then checked his tablet. He reported that Maya had handled the remainder of Flight 112 with complete professionalism, that several passengers had submitted in-flight commendations through the cabin service tablet during the flight naming her specifically, and that the captain had included a personal note in his post-flight report characterizing her performance as exemplary. "That's the first good news," Nate said. In the car moving through the gray Heathrow morning, Nate looked out the window at the orderly choreography of the airport, the long, patient queues of aircraft waiting their turn, the ground crews moving with practiced efficiency through the cold, the slow, enormous ballet of a place that existed entirely to help people get somewhere else. He thought about the complaint files. Not the statistical picture they painted he had already processed, The statistics had processed them 4 months ago in the solitude of his office at 2 in the morning while everyone else in the building was asleep. But the specific individual documents, the voices in them, the particular human texture of what it felt like to have been treated the way those 347 people had been treated, and then to have sat down and written it out in careful, dignified language, because writing it out was the only available avenue, and even then it had ended with a form letter response and a $50 voucher. He thought specifically about a letter from a woman named Gloria, 67 years old, who had written in the careful, slightly formal prose of someone who had composed and recomposed her sentences until they said exactly what she meant, that she had saved for 2 years for a transatlantic trip to visit her daughter and had been moved from her confirmed Economy Plus seat to a middle seat in the last row by an Apex gate agent who told her there had been a system error, and she had watched her original seat be given without explanation to a white male passenger who had complained about sitting beside her. Gloria's letter had been filed, logged, closed with a template. A $50 travel voucher had been emailed to an address she had provided which she had never used. Nate had attached a post-it note to Gloria's letter when he first read it. It said 2 words. "This is why." He took out his dossier in the car and opened to a blank page at the back and wrote 1 line at the top. Maya Director, in-flight experience. Day 1 hire. He underlined it. He closed the dossier. The car moved through the gray London morning toward the Apex Continental Hub offices, and Nate Cole went to work. Cassandra Vale retained a crisis communications consultant named Gregory Holt on the 2nd day after Flight 112, which was the day after the article had 1.4 million views, and the day of the morning show segment that ran her name in a chyron under the words, "Airline purser suspended after confrontation with airline's new owner." And she did it because Gregory came highly recommended by someone she trusted, and because she still believed with the genuine conviction of someone who has not yet fully understood what has happened to them, that the primary problem was a narrative that needed correcting rather than behavior that had consequences. Gregory's plan was constructed with the logic of crisis PR, as it had been practiced for 30 years. Identify the most sympathetic framing available. Deploy it quickly and let it run ahead of the opposing narrative until it became the default one. In Cassandra's case, the framing was devoted employee of 22 years exemplary record, suddenly targeted and publicly humiliated by a billionaire who had used his newly acquired authority to make an example of a dedicated service professional who was only doing her job the way she had been trained to do it. Cassandra agreed to this framing because it required the least adjustment to her own internal account of the evening, and she prepared for the morning television interview with the focused energy of someone who believes that the right performance delivered to the right audience can restructure the truth. She arrived at the studio in a conservative outfit and a composed expression, and when the segment began, she answered the first 3 questions with the measured, slightly tearful professionalism of someone who has rehearsed vulnerability and is deploying it at the calibrated level that research suggests is most effective. The anchor let her talk. And then the anchor opened a folder. Apex Continental's HR system had been accessed by a compliance team operating under Nate's direct authority in the 48 hours following Flight 112, and what they had found in that system was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the complaint data, but it was a surprise to the morning television audience and to Cassandra and to Gregory Holt, who was watching from off-camera, and whose expression as the anchor began reading went through several rapid and poorly concealed stages of professional reassessment. 14 formal passenger complaints had been filed against Cassandra Vale in the preceding 8 years. 11 of those 14 had been filed by passengers of color. Every single one of them had been buried by a union steward who had, for reasons that the compliance investigation was now examining, consistently classified them as resolved without any record of resolution. The anchor read from one complaint aloud. She chose not the most dramatic one, but the most ordinary one. A letter from a father who had written with careful, patient dignity about what it had felt like to be moved from his family's confirmed seats without explanation and watch those seats be reassigned, and who ended his letter by saying that he had written it not for himself, but because he wanted his children to understand that when something unjust happens to you, you name it. You write it down and you send it to the people who are responsible even when you are not sure they will read it. Cassandra stared at the folder on the anchor's desk. The anchor then informed her that Derek Albright had provided investigators with a signed statement. The statement included the full text of what Derek had said on the gate audio recording, and it included Derek's account of a previous conversation in which Cassandra had instructed him to find grounds to deny first-class boarding to certain categories of passengers, because they, in her words, changed the atmosphere of the cabin. The live camera was still running. It captured the moment, the specific, unguarded, irrevocable moment when Cassandra's constructed version of herself collided with the documented version, and the constructed one lost. She said, "Those were misunderstandings." The anchor waited. Cassandra said nothing else. Gregory Holt, watching from off-camera, quietly began gathering his notes. The clip 47 seconds from the question about her record to the silence after misunderstandings became the most shared video on the platform that day, surpassing even the original article, and it was shared not primarily by people who were angry, but by people who recognized in Cassandra's silence something they had seen before in other contexts, the specific quiet of a story that can no longer hold its own weight. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 a.m. in the Apex Continental London Hub's primary conference room, which had the austere, slightly oppressive formality of a room designed to remind everyone in it that the decisions made here carry consequence, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray Heathrow morning, a table long enough to seat 14, and the low-grade tension of 6 board members who have been awake since before dawn, trying to calculate the distance between where they are and where they need to be. Nate sat at the head of the table. Raymond Osei was beside him. The airline's general counsel was present in person. 3 additional board members were on screen from New York, Tokyo, and Chicago, and their faces had the compressed, slightly flattened quality of people managing significant anxiety through a video connection. Gerald Fitch, the most senior board member, the man who had chaired Apex Continental through the 3 years of declining performance that had preceded the acquisition. Silver-haired and industry-weathered, the kind of man who had once been formidable and still had the bearing of it. Even when the substance had begun to thin, spoke first, calmly, and at length, laying out the case for a measured response issue. A comprehensive public statement formalized the suspensions, cooperate with the federal compliance inquiry, and allow the media cycle to run its course while the airline stabilized its operational posture. It was a cogent case built on the logic of every similar crisis response in the past 30 years of the industry, and Nate listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gerald finished, Nate said, "How many times in the last 5 years has Apex responded to a situation like this by waiting for the cycle to pass?" Gerald didn't answer. The answer was visible in his expression. Nate opened his dossier. He placed at the center of the table a document he had been building for 4 months. Not a reactive press strategy, not a crisis management plan, but a comprehensive and fully costed redesign of Apex Continental's hiring criteria, training protocols, complaint, escalation infrastructure, and in-flight service standards built on the analysis of 347 customer complaints and 2 years of internal HR data, and the clear repeating picture they painted together about how this airline's culture had actually functioned at ground level for people who didn't have the resources to fight back against it. He called it the 112 Standard. The name was deliberate. He wanted everyone inside the airline to know where it came from, so that no one could ever suggest it had arrived from nowhere, so that the accountability it represented was permanently attached to a specific incident on a specific flight on a specific evening in Portland, and could not be abstracted into policy language and forgotten. The 112 standard required mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all 4,700 Apex Continental employees within 90 days, delivered not by the existing vendor, but by an independent consultancy that Nate's team had already vetted. A permanent, independently staffed passenger advocacy office with direct reporting to the CEO. The immediate termination of the union steward who had buried 14 complaints against Cassandra Vale over 8 years. Full and proactive cooperation with the federal Title VII investigation. And the promotion of Maya to Director of In-Flight Experience effective the date of landing. One board member, the youngest from the Chicago screen, asked about the legal exposure of moving so quickly before the federal process had concluded. Nate looked at him steadily. The legal exposure from doing nothing has been compounding for 3 years. I've read every complaint in this system. The exposure from doing everything right now completely without hedging is smaller. Not because it's legally safer, because it's true. The vote was called. The 112 standard passed unanimously. Gerald Fitch was the last to vote yes. He held Nate's gaze for a moment before he did it, a long, specific look that carried in it something that was not quite concession and not quite respect, but occupied the ground between them, where two people who disagree about the pace of change can still find a shared coordinate. And then, he said, "I," and looked away. After the meeting, Raymond stayed back while the others filed out and pulled Nate aside near the window with the expression of someone about to deliver the day's best information. Maya had formally accepted the director offer. Her response had arrived 40 minutes after the offer was sent. It was one sentence: "I'll need a full budget and the authority to build a proper team." Nate read the message on Raymond's tablet. He handed it back. And then he smiled. Not the professional, calibrated smile of a boardroom, not the compressed, patient expression of a man managing a difficult situation, but the real one. The one that took slightly longer to arrive and stayed slightly longer than necessary, and reached all the way to his eyes, the smile of someone who has spent a long time working toward something and has just received the first clear evidence that it might actually become real. "Tell her she has it," he said. "All of it." Cassandra Vale and Derek Albright retained a boutique employment attorney named Philip Hare 11 days after Flight 112. And together they filed a $9 million wrongful termination and emotional distress lawsuit against Apex Continental Airways that alleged, among other things, that Nate had acted outside proper corporate authority in suspending them, that the media coverage constituted defamation by omission, and that as dedicated employees with combined tenure of 33 years, they had been denied due process in a manner that caused them severe professional and personal damage. Philip Hare presented this case to his clients with the confidence of someone who has assessed the terrain and found it workable, and they believed him, Cassandra, because she had convinced herself that the morning show interview had gone poorly only because of the folder, not because of what was in it, and Derek because pride had a way of performing the function of hope when the alternative was facing what he had actually done. The discovery phase began 3 weeks later, and it did not go the way Philip Hare had assessed. Nate's legal team did not leak anything. They were careful about that, careful in the specific way of people who understand that the most devastating information is the information that becomes public record through official channels, because official channels give it the weight of institutional confirmation rather than the ambiguity of selective disclosure. The gate audio recording retrieved from the Apex Continental Operational System and submitted to the federal Title VII investigation as part of standard discovery became public record when the investigation opened its preliminary findings. It was not released by anyone at Apex Continental or James Global. It was simply there in the federal record, available to any journalist or member of the public who requested access to public documents, which is to say, available to everyone. The recording ran 9 seconds. In those 9 seconds, Derek Albright's voice captured on the gate system's ambient microphone, at the moment he picked up the phone to call the forward galley of Flight 112, said the following: that there was a passenger heading down the jet bridge to seat 2A, that the ticket had scanned green, but he was certain it was a glitch or fraud, and that Cassandra should keep a close eye on him because, and here the 4 words, he was not our kind of people. 4 words, 9 seconds. Public record. The recording ran on every major news outlet within 6 hours of the federal investigation releasing its preliminary findings, and it ran not with commentary but in full because the 4 words did not require commentary. Philip Hare called Cassandra that evening. He told her he was withdrawing from the case. She asked why, and he said, "Because Derek's recording confirms the instruction came from a prior conversation with you. He's already given investigators a full account. I can't build a defense around a client who is being corroborated against by her own co-plaintiff." Cassandra said she didn't remember saying it. Philip said, "I know." Then he said, "I believe you don't remember." "I also believe you said it." And then he said goodbye. He withdrew the following morning. Cassandra and Derek were left with $60,000 in preliminary legal fees, no representation, and a federal inquiry that was now also examining the pattern of buried complaints across the broader Apex Continental complaint system, which had grown from Cassandra's 14 to a data set of 63 cases over 5 years, involving 11 different crew members, all of them closed without meaningful resolution. All of them involving passengers who had been told in one form or another that they were not the kind of people the airline had organized itself around. Derek Albright, blacklisted by the FAA for filing a false security threat against a passenger and placed on a federal aviation watch list that effectively ended any path back into the industry, spent 4 months applying for positions he never heard back from. Refreshing an email inbox that remained empty, and eventually took an overnight security guard position at a commercial storage facility near the airport he had spent 6 years guarding a more exclusive version of. He worked the graveyard shift. He wore a different uniform now, no Apex Continental wings, no gelled hair, no Zone 1 lane to protect, just a building and a parking lot, and the long, quiet hours between midnight and dawn that had a way of producing the particular kind of thinking that the daylight with its activity and noise and the endless available distraction of being busy made easier to avoid. He did not sleep well. He had stopped sleeping well on the night of Flight 112, and had not recovered it since, which he understood in the specific clear-eyed way of someone who has stopped telling themselves comfortable stories about why things are the way they are, was not a coincidence. 6 months after Flight 112, on a gray Portland morning in late autumn that had the specific quality of a day that had decided to be difficult before it started. Rain, not quite heavy enough to justify an umbrella cold, not quite severe enough to justify real winter clothing. The sky, the particular uniform slate that Pacific Northwest November produces with such reliable consistency that it begins to feel less like weather and more like a state of mind, Cassandra Vale put on a neon green polyester vest over a company-issue gray polo shirt and drove herself to the second job she had found after 4 months of not finding any other kind. The vest was stiff and the polo was slightly too large, and the combination of them worn over the sensible dark pants she had kept from her Apex Continental wardrobe because they were the most professional thing she still owned, produced an effect that she was aware of and had stopped being able to make herself not be aware of the way the body registers the distance between where it has been and where it is now in the specific language of fabric, and fit the way a uniform tells you something about what you are considered to be in a given space. She stood behind the returns counter of a large retail warehouse on the eastern edge of Portland with the contained, careful posture of someone who has learned very recently how much energy it takes to simply be somewhere you did not expect to be, and she processed returns with the attentiveness of someone who understands that attentiveness is now the only professional asset she has left to deploy. The job did not run a deep background check. It had been the 4th position she applied for that did not, and the 1st that had called her back. At 11:15, a customer approached the counter, Sylvia Odom, Portland socialite, full-length camel hair coat. Sunglasses pushed up into carefully maintained hair. The particular hurried impatience of someone who has structured their life around the assumption that their time is more valuable than the time of whoever they are currently speaking to, and who has never had sufficient cause to revise that assumption. Sylvia dropped a used espresso machine onto the counter without making eye contact and said she needed to return it, that she didn't have the receipt because the box had been discarded and that Cassandra should put the credit back on her platinum card. Cassandra recognized her immediately. Sylvia Odom had been a regular on the Seattle to London route, Diamond Elite. The kind of passenger whose name Cassandra had kept in a mental file alongside her preferred seat, and her preference for sparkling over still and the temperature at which she liked her warm towel delivered. She had been in the taxonomy that Cassandra had spent 22 years constructing a passenger who mattered. Sylvia did not recognize Cassandra. She looked at the green vest, the slightly too large polo, the unmaintained roots in the hair that Cassandra used to have professionally colored every 5 weeks, and she saw none of what she was looking at, because she was looking at a function rather than a person, which was a thing that Cassandra had done professionally for 2 decades and understood only from one side until now. Cassandra explained the return policy. She explained it clearly and without condescension in the same professional register she had once reserved for passengers. She had decided deserved it. Sylvia's response was impatience first, then escalation, then the specific register of condescension that comes from someone who has decided that the obstacle in front of them is not worth taking seriously. The voice slightly raised the enunciation, slightly over-deliberate, the implicit message that the person in the uniform is a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be spoken to. Cassandra took it. She took it the way she had watched other people take things like it on the receiving end of her own behavior for 22 years. And what she felt in the receiving of it was not primarily humiliation, though humiliation was present. What she felt primarily was recognition. The specific nauseating clarity of seeing something you have done reflected back at you from the inside. Sylvia leaned forward to read the name tag, and the recognition came slowly traveling across her face like something she wasn't sure she wanted to arrive at. And then it arrived, and she laughed, and the laugh had in it the particular cruelty of someone who finds another person's fall genuinely entertaining. And she said something about first class, and the returns counter, and about how that was pathetic. And the word pathetic landed in the warehouse air and stayed there. Cassandra reached for the radio clipped to her vest. Her hand was steady. Her voice, when she asked for a manager, was steady. And then the steadiness ran out. She cried quietly behind the returns counter in front of a line of holiday shoppers who looked away with the particular discomfort of people who have witnessed something they did not intend to and do not know what to do with. She did not make a sound. The tears simply came, and she let them come because there was nothing left to perform them for. She was not crying because Sylvia had been cruel to her. She was crying because she recognized the cruelty. She had been Sylvia Odom. She had been Sylvia Odom every day for 22 years, from 30,000 feet, wearing a better uniform, and she had never once felt its weight from this side of the counter. Derek Albright's shift at the budget ride car rental kiosk on the fringe of Boeing Field started at midnight and ended at 8, and in the hours between those 2 fixed points, the world conducted itself at a pace and with a cast of characters that bore almost no resemblance to the world he had operated in for the preceding 6 years. There was no Zone 1 lane here. There was no hierarchy of passengers to sort no system of priority and exclusion, to administer no velvet rope, literal or metaphorical, to stand behind and control. There was a small fluorescent-lit kiosk that let in a permanent draft through its sliding doors, a computer terminal that ran on software old enough to have opinions about it, and a relentless, unglamorous procession of tired people arriving at irregular hours from delayed or diverted flights, all of them carrying various versions of the same basic human situation, which was that they needed to get somewhere, and they were counting on Derek to help them do it. He had been at this job for 2.5 months, and in that time something had been happening to him that he did not have the vocabulary for yet, and that he was still in the early stages of being willing to look at directly a slow, unwelcome, entirely private rearrangement of something deep in the way he understood his own previous behavior, moving through him, the way cold moves through a building that has lost its insulation, finding every gap. At 3:20 a.m., the sliding doors opened and a man came in from the dark and the rain dropping a canvas duffel on the linoleum floor with the heavy, graceless thud of someone who has been carrying it for longer than their body wanted to and has arrived at the first available place to set it down. He was young, mid-20s, Derek guessed, wearing a worn college hoodie and work boots, and he had the specific appearance of someone who had been awake for a very long time on an errand that mattered more than sleep. Derek's hands moved to the keyboard before his brain had fully processed the decision. The old instinct, the old assessment, the practiced, quick evaluation of the person in front of him against the template he had spent years constructing and refining, and then he stopped himself. He stopped mid-motion, fingers hovering, and sat for a moment in the unusual experience of catching himself in the act and choosing for reasons he hadn't fully articulated yet, but that felt more foundational than anything he had felt in months to put the template down. The man's name was Darius Webb. His reservation was in the system an economy, compact, confirmed, and prepaid. Derek ran the credit card for the security deposit, and the machine returned a red decline. He looked at the screen. He looked at Darius. Darius said, "I maxed it out on the flight. Last-minute ticket, my mom is in the ICU at Harborview. I have the rental fee, just not the deposit hold. Please, I just need to get there." Derek looked at the screen for a long time. He had the authority to decline the rental. The policy was clear, the procedure was unambiguous, and the decision to enforce it would have been entirely defensible under every operational standard he had ever been given. He could have told Darius to step aside. He could have told him to arrange alternative transportation. He could have explained in the slow, over-enunciated register he used to use for certain passengers that there was nothing to be done. He thought about a boarding pass scanner turning green and a man holding his phone forward, and the specific decision made in under 2 seconds to treat the machine's answer as less reliable than the picture he had already constructed. He thought about what that decision had cost, not to himself, to the man who had done nothing wrong and had simply stood in a line he had every right to stand in. Derek typed his manager override code. He waived the deposit. He looked at the vehicle inventory, selected a premium sedan from the VIP lot, a car that was sitting unused and would sit unused for the rest of the night, and typed it into the reservation without announcement or explanation. "Card reader's been acting up tonight," he said, and his voice sounded different than it used to, quieter, slower, stripped of the particular kind of confidence that had always been less about what he knew and more about what he had decided to believe. "Don't worry about the deposit. I'm out of compacts, so you're getting an upgrade. Free. Just get to the hospital." Darius Webb looked at him across the counter with the wide, startled expression of someone who had prepared themselves for one more closed door and found an open one instead. And the gratitude in his face was so complete and so genuine that it went straight past everything Derek had constructed between himself and the feelings he had been avoiding for 6 months. He handed over the keys. He said, "Drive safe." He watched the sedan's taillights dissolve into the rain. He sat down in his squeaking office chair. The terminal was empty. Outside, beyond the glass, the distant blinking lights of a jet climbed through the low clouds and disappeared into the dark overhead. He was not redeemed. He knew that. He had done one right thing in the middle of a very long night with no one watching and no consequence either way, and it was not enough to balance what he had done before. but it was something. And in the specific accounting of a person who has stopped telling himself comfortable stories, something is the only available currency, and you spend it where you can. He sat in the empty kiosk for a long time after the taillights were gone in the quiet that comes after a right decision, which is a different kind of quiet than the other kind. 8 months after Flight 112 on a Tuesday morning in early summer, when Portland had finally decided to behave like a city that believed in the sun, Maya stood at the front of a training room on the 3rd floor of the Apex Continental Portland hub and looked out at 60 flight attendants who were looking back at her, and the room had the specific charged quality of a space in which something is about to begin. She was 23 years old. She was the director of in-flight experience. She was wearing the redesigned Apex Continental uniform, the same midnight blue, but with a small, deliberate modification to the lapel pin. The new Pinnacle Service Award, redesigned under the 112 standard, was smaller and quieter than the old one, and it was given not for tenure or for the satisfaction ratings of premium passengers, but for something the selection criteria described as demonstrated dignity in service, which meant in practice the record of how you treated the passenger who had no power to reward or punish you for the way you did it. Maya had been the first person to receive the new version. She had not started the session yet. She was looking at the far wall where a framed copy of the 112 Standards opening principle was mounted beside the whiteboard. The handwritten line from Nate's dossier that had been reproduced in Arjun Mehta's article and had subsequently become quietly and without fanfare the most quoted single sentence in the coverage of everything that had followed Flight 112. Culture is not what leadership says it is. It is what the lowest paid employee experiences at 6 a.m. She began. Her first sentence was not a policy point or a protocol summary or an organizational welcome. It was a story, short, specific, and entirely true, about a plastic cup of lukewarm tap water that she had carried down an aisle 8 months ago because she had been told by the person above her that the bottled water was unavailable, and she had known the bottled water was not unavailable. And she had done it anyway because she was 22 years old, and she had not yet developed the thing that she was here today to help 60 people develop. The room was absolutely still. She asked them, "How many of you have been asked to do something on this airline that you knew was wrong, and you did it anyway because you were afraid?" Every hand in the room went up. All 60. Not gradually, not reluctantly, all at once, with the specific collective release of people who have been waiting for a long time for someone to ask them a question they already knew the answer to. Maya looked at the hands. She let them stay up for a moment. Then she said, "That ends today. Not because someone in a boardroom decided it does, because you decided it does. You're the airline, not the logo, not the fleet. You when you walk down that aisle and someone presses a call button. That's the airline." Later that afternoon, Raymond Osei sent Nate a single message from Portland. You should have seen that training room. Nate read it at his desk in Chicago, where a Tuesday sky was doing something genuinely beautiful through the window, in the way of clear summer afternoons when the light arrives at the right angle and makes everything it touches look briefly essential. He thought about the post-it note on Gloria's letter. He thought about Darius Webb driving through the dark rain toward the hospital at 3:30 in the morning. He thought about Maya standing at the front of a training room with 60 hands in the air. He thought about an 11-year-old version of himself riding 3 buses to school in East Baltimore, arriving at doors that looked at him the way certain doors had always looked at him and continuing through them anyway because stopping was never an available option, and because he had learned very early that the doors that were hardest to walk through were usually the ones that led somewhere worth going. He filed Raymond's message. He returned to his work. Outside, the Tuesday light moved slowly across the floor of his office and disappeared. 1 year after Flight 112, Portland International Airport's Terminal C had a new room. It was not large. It could seat 18 people, comfortably 20 if the afternoon rush required it. and it had been designed with the specific intentionality of a space built by people who have spent time thinking about what it feels like to need help in an airport and not know where to find it or whether it will arrive in the form of more trouble than it resolves. The chairs were good chairs. The lighting was warm and not fluorescent. There was a desk near the entrance staffed around the clock, and behind the desk there would always be a person whose job description contained the phrase, "to listen first and act second," a phrase that Maya had written personally into the position's charter and that Nate had approved in one reading. The passenger advocacy suite had been Maya's idea. She had submitted the proposal 6 weeks into her directorship, accompanied by a 40-page document that included a full budget breakdown, a staffing model, an architectural brief, and a section at the end titled, "Why This Matters More Than Anything Else." We could build that contained, among other things, a summary of Gloria's letter. Nate had approved it in one sentence. Build it. Now he stood beside Captain Howard Briggs at the suite's entrance. Both of them in civilian clothes which felt right for the occasion, the way certain moments call for the person rather than the uniform, and watched a small gathered crowd of people who had been part of what had happened over the past year and were here to mark the fact that something had come of it. The crowd was not large. Maya had specifically requested that it not be large. There were airline staff and terminal employees and a handful of frequent flyers who had been invited by personal letter, and there were 2 people Nate recognized from the complaint files. Not Gloria, who had been invited, but whose health prevented her from traveling, but 2 others, both of whom had accepted, and both of whom had arrived in the quiet, slightly cautious way of people who have learned to manage their own expectations about institutional promises and are still carefully deciding whether to lower their guard. The ribbon was cut. The applause was genuine and not loud, which is the best kind. Captain Briggs shook Nate's hand. He held it a beat longer than a handshake usually runs. He said, "I owe you an apology. I should have looked closer." Nate said, "You supported your crew with the information you had. What matters is what a person does when they get better information." Briggs held his gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who has been thinking about a specific evening for a full year and has arrived finally at a settled place, with it not without cost, but settled. He nodded and let go of Nate's hand. Across the entrance, Maya was laughing at something a junior attendant had said. A real laugh, the unguarded kind that arrives without warning and stays longer than the professional register usually permits. And the new pinnacle pin on her jacket caught the terminal light and held it quietly smaller and less declarative than the old one doing what it was designed to do. Arjun Mehta was there standing near the back of the gathered crowd with the look of someone attending something he helped make happen and finding the experience stranger than he'd expected. The particular discomfort of a journalist in the story he reported present had a consequence of something he wrote, watching real people move through the space his words had been part of creating. He and Nate exchanged a nod from across the room. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither needed to. Lena Schultz was not there. She was in surgery, which was where she usually was on Tuesday mornings, but a card was taped to the frame of the suite's entrance door, written in her neat, direct hand. For everyone who ever needed someone to speak up and didn't have anyone. Nate stood alone for a moment after the crowd began to thin in the entrance of the suite, looking at the quiet room, the good chairs, the warm light, the desk with a young woman behind it who was already talking with someone leaning slightly forward with the attentive, unhurried body language of a person who has been trained to listen and has discovered in the training that listening was something she wanted to do anyway. He thought about whether any of this would have happened without one specific evening in November, one flight, one boarding lane, one plastic cup of lukewarm tap water. He stood with the question for a moment, and then he let it go because the question about origin was less useful than the question about continuation, and the question about continuation had an answer that was currently sitting in a good chair across the room from a desk where someone was ready to help, and that was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. He walked out of the suite and back into the terminal, into the ordinary, brilliant noise of an airport going about its business of helping people get to where they needed to be. 1 year and 1 day after Flight 112, Nate Cole boarded Apex Continental. Flight 112. Again, the same route. Portland to London. The same gate, the same aircraft type, the same seat, 2A. A flight attendant he had not met before came to his suite before pushback and offered still water without being asked, and said there was a warm meal whenever he was ready, and said his name the way people say a name when they actually know it, rather than reading it off a screen, and Nate said, "Thank you," and meant it, the way he always meant it when the ordinary things worked. The way the ordinary things were supposed to work, which is to say, not with gratitude for something exceptional, but with the quiet, specific appreciation of a person who understands what it costs to get there and does not take it for granted. He opened his dossier. He did not open it to the complaint section. He opened it to the blank pages at the back where his own notes had been accumulating for a year, and he began to write. In the galley pinned beside the crew roster on the small corkboard that every Apex Continental aircraft carried as part of the 112 standard, there was a laminated card that Maya had placed on every flight in the fleet 8 months ago, and which had been handled so many times by so many different hands since then that its edges had gone soft and its corners had begun to curl slightly with the particular warmth of a thing that has been touched by many people who found in it something worth returning to. The card said, "Every passenger is someone's reason for getting on a plane. Treat them accordingly." It was the only piece of text in the entire Apex Continental operational manual that had not been written by a committee, and it showed in the best possible way it had the directness of a sentence written by a person who knew from experience exactly what it meant. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at Portland International and lifted, climbing through the low Pacific Northwest cloud cover and breaking through into the clean upper air where the sun was already present and waiting unhurried the way the sun always is at that altitude above the weather and the noise and the accumulated weight of everything that happens below it. Through the oval window of Suite 2A, the city fell away, the terminals, the runways, the long gray lines of the streets stretching eastward toward the mountains. All of it becoming small and quiet and distant. And then the clouds came up and closed over it all, and there was only the sky, which was the same sky it had always been, indifferent to the small human dramas played out below it, making no distinction between the window it appeared in and the person looking through it. Nate leaned his seat back. He closed his eyes. Outside, the engine note settled into its steady transatlantic frequency, the sound of a machine doing what it was built to do, carrying people forward, not asking who they were or where they had come from or whether the space they occupied was space they deserved. Just carrying them forward. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took some of us longer than it should have to understand it. If this story moved you, if you believe that every person who boards a plane deserves to be treated like they matter, regardless of what they're wearing or what they look like, please subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the real flight hasn't landed yet. It's still going.